fled the town. Yet few of them conceded this was the end of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's mad experiment. Omar, a Palestinian refugee who grew up in Syria, told me, maybe the Americans rule the world today, but God Almighty promised the Muslims that in the end the world will be ruled by Islam.
That was CNN's Ben Wiedemann back in March, covering the final push, what many in northern Syria hoped was the final push against ISIS. Ben Wiedemann joins us now tonight. Ben, I heard you say that the pullout, the sudden pullout of U.S. forces from northern Syria that President Trump announced just several days ago is essentially nullifying all the efforts that were put to try to defeat ISIS.
Yes, let's remember that the reason U.S. forces went into northeast Syria in the first place a few years ago was to defeat ISIS. And certainly earlier this year, when we were there for almost 2 months, the focus was on the final battle against ISIS as a physical caliphate, as something on the map. But nobody was under the impression back then that the elimination of the caliphate would mean the elimination of ISIS. And in fact, in August, the Inspector General of the Pentagon put out a report saying that they believed that there were anywhere between 14 and 18,000 ISIS fighters still on the loose in remote areas, in sleeper towns across Syria and Iraq, that they had as much as $400 million at their disposal, and that it remains a threat. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, still is on the loose, and therefore it's a different threat, but the threat still exists. And for the United States to so precipitously pull out of Syria without really any warning to anybody has simply thrown that whole effort into the bin. Now we know that ISIS has already been able, some of their fighters, their families have been able to escape some of the prisons and the detention camps in that part of Syria. And it was only last month that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi called upon his supporters in an audio message to tear down the walls of those camps and those prisons to free their comrades. And that possibility has not been so close, certainly since the final battle against the physical caliphate, which ended in late March.
Ben, I should just let our viewers know, because I neglected to mention it off the top. I'm actually in Columbus, Ohio right now, doing this off an iPhone. So that's why the quality is a little bit shaky, because I'm just holding an iPhone up. We're here to prepare for tomorrow's Democratic presidential debate. But obviously, with what is going on in Syria, we wanted to devote the program tonight, to Full Circle tonight, to the situation in northern Syria. And that's why we're focusing on that for the entire Full Circle. So, Ben, what happens now? I mean, you now have Turkish forces in northern Syria. The Kurds have basically, I believe, made some sort of an overture to the Syrian regime, which is also backed by Russia. How does that change the calculus on the ground? And this fight between Turkey and the Kurds, where do you see that going?
Well, the fact that the Kurds, and let's remember that the Syrian Democratic Forces includes Kurds, it includes Arabs, there are various kinds of Christians among them as well. But their attitude is, and particularly the Kurdish component within the SDF, is, in the words of one of their leaders, it is better to compromise with Damascus than to be subject to what they say is genocide from the Turkish forces. And therefore, there was really a choice between the devil they know, Bashar al-Assad, and the deep blue sea, which is the threat of a Turkish military takeover. Keep in mind that the official Turkish plan, Anderson, that President Erdogan proposed, even at the United Nations General Assembly last month, was a 30-kilometer, about 19-mile deep so-called safe zone all along about a 450-kilometer, 300 whatever miles of the Turkish-Syrian border. That stretch of land basically includes all of the major, predominantly Kurdish cities and towns in northern Syria. So this would spell the end of any sort of autonomous entity for the Kurds. And one of Erdogan's stated intentions is to resettle perhaps more than 1 million Syrian refugees. There are about 3.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey right now, is to essentially forcibly resettle them in that predominantly Kurdish part of the country, which could lead to ethnic fighting between Kurds and Arabs, because most of those Syrian refugees come from Western Syria. They have no connection to this area. So really, the situation is in flux. Now, if the Turks decide to just take a very limited area, not their sort of maximal demand, so to speak, there may be some sort of stabilization of the area with the deployment of Syrian regime troops in that part of the country. And in a sense, the area that's controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, which the United States was, in a sense, protecting, was a third of the country. So the regime in Damascus will regain control effectively of the last major part of the country that is not under its control. So it's a victory for the Syrians. It's a victory for the Russians, who, of course, have supported the Syrian regime from going back decades. And in a sense, it's a victory for Iran as well, which has also been a major backer of the Syrian regime. And we find the United States is in this, is backed itself into a corner. It refuses to talk to the Syrians. President Trump, just less than an hour ago, has announced the intention to slap some very serious sanctions on Turkey. So they're having problems with Turkey. The Americans obviously aren't speaking with Iran. So they're essentially, they've pulled themselves out, the Americans, of the equation. It's a victory for Syria, first of all, for Russia, for Iran, while the United States basically leaves with its tail between its legs.
And in the process has betrayed an ally which has lost more than 10,000 casualties in the fight against ISIS, as I understand it, and which the U.S. really relied on to fight ISIS. It wasn't thousands of U.S. troops actually doing the fighting. There was a more logistical and support role and training role.
Yeah, but this is the irony of the situation. Going back a little before that, I was in Iraq when the Americans and their allies invaded in 2003. And from the very beginning, you could see that there was already a certain amount of hostility from Iraqis towards the Americans and the American allies. What I saw in northeastern Syria was they were genuinely welcomed by the local population, which saw the Americans and the French and the British and the Canadians and others as coming in to save them from ISIS, to allow this experiment in autonomy to actually function. And I tell you, I first went to that part of Syria in my reincarnation as a journalist, because I used to live in Syria before that. But I went there in December 2015. That whole area, it was poor, it was underdeveloped, it had not been destroyed in the fighting. But when I went back a few years later, I was struck at how prosperous and bustling this part of the country was. This was an area where Americans and others who were helping the people in that part of Syria were genuinely welcomed. And I think that it's hard to understate the depth of disappointment and anger over this move by the United States. There was very little in the, even though in December of last year, President Trump first came up with the idea of, getting out of Syria immediately. Then he backtracked. But it was clear from back then that he wanted to get out as quickly as possible. And so, I mean, we are not talking about months. It was 8 days ago when President Trump had this conversation with President Erdogan in Turkey and said, we're stepping aside, conduct your operation. And in those 8 days, this experiment in autonomy, the illusion of a victory over ISIS has completely vanished and has been replaced by panic and fear.
So, in terms of the battle against ISIS, if U.S. forces, the president has, I know, just has said that they're going to leave a small number of forces in the south of Syria for some anti-ISIS operations, and will leave some forces in the region to monitor developments. What does that actually mean for the fight against ISIS?
It effectively means that the United States has departed the scene, as particularly in Syria. There's still U.S. forces in Iraq, but in Syria, they're gone. And there's this one U.S. position base in a place called Tanf, which is in the southeast. And the purpose of that was to somehow have a way to monitor any potential movement of ammunition and weapons coming from Iran through Iraq and into Syria. But that's in a different part of the country, in a sense. The area where ISIS thrived and spread and had its de facto capital, Raqqa, the United States is gone, and it will, with this agreement between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the regime in Damascus, it means the United States will no longer have a willing and friendly host that it has with the Syrian Democratic Forces. That's gone. If the Syrian regime takes effective control over that third of the country that was previously controlled by the U.S. ally, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the United States will not be allowed back. It's as clear as day from the perspective of here. I don't know how it looks from the Oval Office.
So the notion that American forces could go back in to northern Syria in a fight against ISIS, is that realistic at all? Or is that something that would only happen with the approval of the Syrian regime, which has now will be taking, if this deal goes forward with the Kurds and the as you said, there's some Christian forces as well in the SDF. Would American forces go back in any numbers in order to conduct operations, or is that just not even possible?
It's a fantasy. It's a pipe dream. It is not possible. The Russians have made it clear from a long time ago they don't want American forces in Syria. They are not going to turn around for the sake of President Trump and say, come on in. They have emerged victorious. They have outmaneuvered the United States. And there's just no way. I can't put it any other way. There's no way the Americans will be allowed back in, period.
The prisons which hold ISIS fighters, as many as 10,000 ISIS fighters, as well as family members. What is this? Do we know much about the exact status of those?
Most of them remain in these camps, in these prisons. But there have been a variety of incidents where there have been breakouts, particularly hundreds of family members in one particular camp at a place called Ain Issa near the Turkish border, very much within the firing range of Turkish forces. And in fact, it's when they've come under bombardment and everybody's had to take cover, that is when a lot of these breakouts occur. Now, the United States, President Trump announced that two notorious British members of ISIS, known as the Beatles, who had tortured and executed Western hostages, have been transferred out of Syria to Iraq. But the United States planned to take several dozen high-value ISIS prisoners out of Syria in the past few days, but because of the chaos that has ensued, they are no longer able to take them out, and there are just a few dozen out of, as I said, around 10,000 prisoners, most of them Syrians and Iraqis, but about 2,000 of them are foreign fighters. They are currently, most of them, in these prisons, but the Kurds made it clear, the Syrian Democratic Forces made it clear very early on, in fact, long before President Trump even had made this precipitous decision 8 days ago, that in the event of a Turkish invasion, they would have to focus their forces, and we're not talking about a big army here. We're just talking about tens of thousands of troops against the second largest army in NATO, Turkey. They warned that they would have to pull some of their men and women away from those camps and prisons and send them to the front line. So the warning signs, the flashing red lights, were obvious going back months. But it appears that President Trump, in a moment of rashness, threw caution to the wind, and now we find ourselves in this very dangerous situation regarding the ISIS prisoners and regarding so many other ramifications that were sort of flying at us by the hour. Anderson?
Yeah. I mean, even the ripple effects globally in terms of other allies, belief in the United States' or this administration's willingness to have their back, to stand by our allies, this may have ripple effects on that in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Ben Wiedemann, I appreciate your reporting always. Thanks for the in-depth conversation on Full Circle. We really appreciate it. I hope you join us for AC 360 tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern. I'm actually going to have a real camera for that show. But we appreciate you watching Full Circle. At 8 p.m. tonight, we're going to have the latest on what's happening in northern Syria. Very fast-moving developments. We'll obviously also have a preview of what's to come tomorrow night here in Columbus, Ohio, where 12 candidates, Democratic presidential candidates, will gather on one stage, largest debate ever undertaken. And we'll have